Okay, so this video is going to be a bit slapdash compared to what I normally do. I just came off a 12-hour filming day, and I've still got to prepare the footage and get it ready for editing, so this isn't scripted or anything, but I thought it deserved a response, and this is Sargon of Akkad, and you've heard me mention him before in my videos and in the podcast. I like Sargon, I'm a subscriber, and I've been a fan for a long time, and he answered Anarchy Ball's questions that, actually, I'm not sure who did it. Anarchy Ball posted it, so did that guy T, so did some others, but whoever did it asked all these questions for statists, and Sargon answered, and so I thought it was worth a response.
I'm not a libertarian, but of all of the ideological groups on the internet, I find them probably the least objectionable.
Well, I'm glad he finds us least objectionable, but I want to point out, libertarianism isn't a political ideology, but the absence of one. Libertarianism is based on the non-aggression principle, which simply means that you don't force other people to do things your way. And that makes it not only not an ideology, that makes it very humble. Because political ideologies are all about, this is what I believe, and so I'm going to force it on everyone else. Well, libertarians are humble. We don't know the best way to run your life. We don't know the best way to build the roads. We don't know the best way to run a healthcare system. And we don't think anyone else does either, certainly not to the point where they get to force their way on everyone else. So what we want is a system where everyone is free to experiment with their own solutions, keep the ones that work for them and discard the ones that don't. Radical idea, I know. And then that's how we actually progress. And that's gotta be 1,000 times better than saying, okay, here's my idea. I'm gonna force it on everyone. I'm not even gonna let anyone try to do anything else. And, oh gee, look at that. No one else is doing it. Well, it must be because government's necessary. Wrong.
Okay, so statist is definitely the first thing I want to address. There is no such thing as a statist.
Statist is a word. It goes back at least as far as Shakespeare. According to the online etymology dictionary, the word statism in its current meaning dates to 1880, and specifically in contrast to individualism in 1919. So this word has been around a while. Statist is a little more recent, but it's not like something we just made up this decade.
No one identifies as a statist.
Doesn't matter. It's still a word that describes them. If the label fits, own it.
So saying, hey statists, means you're not addressing anyone.
Yes, we are. We're addressing people who want to initiate force in one way or another.
I mean, a statist could literally be anyone who isn't a libertarian.
Yes. That's the idea. Statism is defined as the contrary to a libertarian. A libertarian is someone who abides by the nap in all things. So if there's something where you want to initiate force against people, then you're not a libertarian, you're a statist. At least in that one area.
You could literally just say, hey non-libertarians, when you say hey statists.
Let's think about it this way. An atheist has questions for the religious, so they say, hey, believers. Would you complain about that label and say that they should say, hey, non-atheists? We're not asking questions specifically for progressives or conservatives or whoever, but all of them together. We are casting a wide net in the hopes that somewhere among them there will be someone who can argue rationally for an initiation of force.
I find it really bizarre that a movement that is so deeply individualist would collectivize literally everyone else as well.
Sargon, that isn't what collectivism means.
To me, government seems to be a necessary evil to enforce the social contract.
Oh geez, social contract. How many times, people? How many times do we have to debunk that complete and utter nonsense? There is no validity whatsoever to the concept of a social contract. Number 7 in my video, How to Argue for Statism. I have a couple of other videos as well. All cover the social contract, and it's complete and utter nonsense.
Because the government isn't a bully, and the employer isn't the parent of the employees.
Government isn't a bully, but what happens if you don't pay?
The employer will pay the employees the minimum amount they can get away with.
Yes, and the government comes and takes tax money, leaving them with even less.
The government has an obligation to the people that they tax. They aren't simply taking their money for the fun of it, so they can spend it as they want.
Funny, that's how it looks. And who holds them to their obligation? How can we possibly hold government to its obligation when, as one of the questioners points out, they wasted more money on a plane that doesn't work than it would take to build a house for every homeless person in America? or when they rack up a $19 trillion national debt, or when they drop bombs on children in countries where we aren't even at war.
I realize that in the United States...
Sargon, this isn't just the U.S. Your country does it too. Your country is just as complicit in the war on terror as the U.S. is. Your wonderful NHS starves elderly people to death to free up bed space and is now denying basic medical procedures to anyone with a high BMI or who smokes. We pay attention to what's going on over there, and it isn't pretty. In many ways, it's worse than what's happening in the U.S. The next two questions, he basically agrees with us, so we'll skip those.
I don't want to ban anything that isn't actively causing harm to people against their will. For example, child pornography, sex trafficking, anything like that. That's fine to ban. And I'm sure libertarians would also agree these things should be banned because, as Julie just said, these things are causing trouble. And if it's not causing trouble, why would you want to ban it? I agree.
Sargon, are you sure you didn't just admit to being a libertarian? You only want to go after people who are causing trouble, not peaceful people. That's the nap! Of course, you just supported the idea of taxation, so if you're watching this, here's another question for you. Why is a tax evader someone who is causing trouble just because he didn't fill out 10 million forms and send half his income to the state on April 15th? You cannot passively cause trouble. Yet, not paying taxes is passive, and the government will come after you for it if you don't pay them.
I totally agree. And I think
except when it comes to taxation.
Government should exist. I suppose by definition I would be a statist. But, like I've just said, I don't want to ban any of these things. I think if something is not causing any trouble, then you shouldn't ban it. There's no moral grounds to ban it. There's no justification, so why would you do it? But Julie's talking to me as if I want this sort of thing, which I don't.
Well, a lot of statists do, and this is a general open question to statists. If a question doesn't apply to you, you can just skip over it, except it kind of does, doesn't it? Because you want to point guns at people who don't give up a portion of their income to the state. That's what taxation means.
I find it interesting that this chap has to use examples from 100 years ago.
He didn't just use examples from 100 years ago, Sargon. He was also talking about things like regulations.
Justify asking this question. Government is also the only method by which the poor have any control over the rich, or the way to ensure their own rights. They're too poor.
That's just a load of crap. Control over the rich? Sure. No one should have control over anyone else. Not the rich over the poor, not the poor over the rich. But what was that you had said?
The only method by which the poor have any control over the rich, or the way to ensure their own rights. They're too poor.
But ensuring their own rights? Oh, come on! Give me a break. Have you not been paying any attention to what's been happening in either of our countries? You have a welfare state that is impoverishing people. The welfare state is the reason why you have multi-generational poverty. Before the welfare state, no one stayed poor for that long. No one stayed poor for more than a couple of years. Certainly not long enough to pass it on to their children. But then along comes the welfare state. In your country a lot earlier than ours, but still, it's the same effect. That's the thing that keeps down the poor. That's what Tucker was talking about, and that is what you need to answer.
So it literally is the only method that the poor have to protect themselves from the rich.
No, it isn't. In a free market, they absolutely have... They don't really have a need to protect themselves from the... What can the rich do to you in a free market? Huh? What do? They provide you goods and services at a reasonable price. Oh, the fiends. You only need protection from the rich when you have government.
Even if the rich control the government, that doesn't mean that they're despots. They don't just have free reign to do whatever it is they want.
Actually, yeah, it kind of does.
And the poor, as Brexit and Trump are demonstrating, can and do make themselves heard. It's just for a very long time they haven't needed to because the situation hasn't been that bad. However, it is that bad now, and, well, the governments are going to have to start listening.
I have heard this. Over and over and fucking over again. They said it in 2012. They said it in 2008. They say it every single election. Oh, but look at what's happening this time. Now the government's going to have to start listening. It's an illusion, Sargon. It's a complete illusion. It's just theater. It's just virtue signaling, to use your term. It's just saying, ooh, here we are. I'm all about the poor. Do you really think Trump is all about the poor? Do you really think Hillary is all about the poor? Do you really think any of these schmoes are all about the poor?
Unless, of course, you think that they should be rioting in the streets, which I think is a net negative for everyone.
No, I advocate a peaceful dismantling of the government.
I don't see who benefits from riots. I think that a responsible government that upholds the social contract rather than abuses it is a good idea, and I think...
And when has there been any government at all in history that has done this, even once? See, this is one of the big problems with the social contract. There's all sorts of enforcement for when you and I violate it, but where is the enforcement when government violates it?
Refusing, for example, to obey the laws that were agreed upon by our democratically elected leaders, then we could find ourselves in a position where I'm having my rights violated and you are violating a law, and the government does not have the power to enforce the law over you.
See, this is why we use the phrase cult of the omnipotent state. Sargon, you are pretending like the government, which is nothing more than a group of people, are the only ones who can do this. That only makes sense if you believe they have supernatural powers. And I'm sure you're going to protest this and say, oh, well, it's not supernatural at all. But if it's not, then what's stopping any other group of people from doing it? What's stopping you from doing it? I mean, and this question had to do with the right to keep and bear arms. That is a great way that it happens. Because the problem is not there are people with guns out there who want to do evil things. It's that there are people out there with guns who want to do evil things against unarmed people. I mean, do I have to link yet again to Davi Barker's analysis of the mass shootings and how low the body count in those is when there's an armed citizen present to stop it? Yeah, I mean, it's what I forget what it is off the top of my head, but it's like 14 point something. When they're just left to run their course or they're stopped by the police. But with an armed citizen present, it's like 1.8. I mean, it's just no contest. There is nothing any group of people at all can do against an armed populace. And, I mean, we keep pointing this out. That's why Hitler didn't invade Switzerland. He invaded all the countries around it. Don't give me any of this crap about the mountainous terrain. That didn't stop him anywhere else. But it did in Switzerland. Why? People there are armed to the teeth. You can't really subjugate an armed population.
This is obviously an unacceptable position. I'm sure you'd agree for me and for you, because I would be able to do the same thing for you. Basically, you want to regress us back to a state of brute savagery.
No, that's what you're doing by saying that only one group should be allowed to initiate force against others.
Where you would end up with basically northern Mexico. It's not a good idea.
Yeah, how is northern Mexico libertarian?
It just ends in bloodshed and savagery and is entirely not conducive to a peaceful life.
It's interesting that one of the most peaceful episodes in history was actually the Wild West. It was one of the lowest murder rates in history. I think we're finally just getting our murder rates down to where it was then, and this is actually a bit lower than where it is in the UK now, and the UK is always like, oh, well, look how few murders we have. Well, okay, look how fewer murders there were in the Wild West. So, yeah, don't believe the movies.
Being able to own a gun is them challenging the government's monopoly on force. It's not. It's them being able to form a well-regulated militia to...
Which is the same thing. I mean, how do you think our government got started? It was when we sent the Tories packing back across the Atlantic. Yep, that's what it was. That's the whole point of the militia, was to defend the people against whoever, whether it's local criminals, whether it's an invading army, or whether it's their own government. It's in the Declaration of Independence. The people have the right to alter or abolish the government.
But you can't sit there and simply say, well, government's the problem, let's get rid of it, which I'm guessing someone called Anarchy Ball is going to be advocating for.
I think you're kind of missing the point of the question here. These statistics on democide show that I believe it was 262 million people in the 20th century who were murdered by their own governments, not counting wars, not counting capital punishment, just outright acts of democide. Over the same time period, there were 9 million private murders. How is government not a cure far worse than the disease. I mean, if you're saying we need government to keep people from committing murder, and they commit more murders than people do, then how can you argue this? And you complain about this being monolithic. Well, actually, because it kind of is. Because governments have that tendency to move towards the same kind of thing. I mean, who would have thought before 9/11 the United States would become like it is now, spying on its own citizens, dropping bombs on children in countries where we aren't even at war, actually advocating torture and saying people who are against torture are unpatriotic. Could you imagine someone trying to do that in, say, 1985? In 1985, we still had the Cold War. We still had this evil empire, the Soviet Union we were fighting, and still we didn't do that. But this is the tendency of governments. Every single one of them follows this progression. And you either learn that lesson or you end up like Venezuela.
But yeah, what good would it be if a government just piled up its citizens' money and didn't use it?
I don't think that was actually an answer to the question.
Keeping 100% of a person's income is not slavery. It's not far off, and it's not very fair, and it's undoubtedly going to absolutely cripple that person and make them utterly dependent on the government. But that's not slavery.
Why is it not slavery, Sargon? I mean, are you not claiming ownership over someone else's labor, and therefore not claiming ownership over the very body and mind that is being used to provide that? How is that not slavery? You haven't answered that.
Can a bunch of people who don't have the right to do a certain thing grant to somebody else the right to do it?
The answer is yes, they can. We do this all the time. This is what every government is predicated on.
He's not asking whether it happens. He's asking about the philosophical legitimacy of the concept.
And fundamentally, this is what the social contract is.
Which is one more reason why it's bullshit.
The agreement that we will all live by a certain selection of laws. For example, I'm not allowed to hold you against your will. However...
Well, that's an initiation of force.
If you violate certain laws, for example, if you were to hold me against my will, then the government would be completely entitled. In fact, it would be mandatory for the government to then hold you against your will as not only the justice that I would deserve to see you being punished for the crime you committed against me, but as a disincentive to other people from committing that same crime against other people.
I really don't think you get the philosophy here, Sargon. The idea is that if someone is holding you against your will, anyone, whether they're in the government or not, has the right to come in under force of arms and extract the person from you. Right? Everyone has that right, government or not. That's not what the question is. What if it's not? Why do you statists, and you are a statist, Sargon, I'm sorry, but you are. Why do you statists always use examples that involve an initiation of force? Let's use one that doesn't. Okay? What if instead of holding someone against their will, that person is working for me voluntarily for a wage that we have both agreed on in an arrangement that we're both happy with, and yet you come along and say, oh, that's bad because you're only paying him $7 an hour, you should be paying him $10 an hour. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. If you or I don't have a right to go over with guns and make him do something different, how does government get that legitimacy?
Why are you comfortable spending borrowed money knowing your children will have to pay it off down the line? You're increasing their eventual taxes before they can even vote. Isn't that the definition of taxation without representation?
Again, another failure for the term statist. I'm not in favour of that. I doubt very many people are in favour of that. Maybe the...
Well, I think you just defeated a lot of your own arguments here, especially about the social contract. You're against it, and not very many people are for it, and yet it happens. It's happening in the US, it's happening in the UK, it's happening in the EU. So, what's up with that?
You do realize that making something illegal won't make it go away. Guns, drugs, the black market will provide.
Because a law is the only way you're going to see any justice. If someone breaks a law and violates your rights...
Okay, what sort of justice is required for someone smoking a doobie before bed? What sort of justice is required in someone owning a Beretta? Yeah, what sort of justice is required in that situation?
This acts as a massive disincentive to people who would otherwise break this law and violate your rights, but decide they won't because they have something to lose.
Again, you're acting like government is absolutely the only way this can happen. And if you want to look, at one example, just Google DDROs. That's Defense and Dispute Resolution Organization, something like that. This is something that some anarcho-capitalists have come up with as just an example, not the way, but just an example of how it might work in an anarcho-capitalist society. Another thing you might look at is L. Neil Smith's North American Confederacy series, which I enjoyed immensely. I actually think the Probability Broach and Tom Paine-Maru actually approach what I would call great science fiction. But the idea is it's an alternate timeline where America has become Smith's idea of an ideal libertarian society, and he has things called like the Civil Liberties Association and things like that, and they managed to do all of this. The difference is, Sargon, the difference between these ideas and your government is that you don't have a single organization with a monopoly. And so here's another question for you if you're watching this. Why are all monopolies bad except for the ones that government makes? Because monopolies are pretty much universally despised. Even we libertarians aren't that fond of them. We love competition. That's why we love free markets. So what's wrong with saying, okay, let's have these competing organizations do it? At least let's have, and this is really all we're asking for, let's have the freedom to try something different to see if it might work. Why is that so much to ask for?
This strikes me as the ultimate libertarian fantasy. The one-man island. You don't have enough guns to prevent people from taking these away from you. You simply don't. If the government was abolished and you lived in a state of anarchy, you would lose all of this very quickly to a very well-organized gang of very dangerous people who would come and take it.
Now, Sargon, what's stopping some other organized gang of people from defending him? This is what I really don't get, this argument against anarchy. Because if one group of people can do something, so can another group of people. And besides, a group of people with a whole bunch of guns could get together and take your stuff. Sounds like a government to me. So the absolute worst case scenario in an anarchy is that a government will form. Gotta love it.
Knowing all of this, do you still think the government can spend your money more wisely than you can?
No, not really. I'm sure that government is practically the worst way of doing anything, except for certain features that can't be done practically in any other way.
Again, government is just a group of people. So how come it can't be done by any other group of people?
Example, military. The last thing you want are privately funded armies. Just the very last thing. Armies that are literally fighting for nothing but pay are the worst armies imaginable.
Okay, first of all, that kind of sounds like what we have now, because since we don't have conscription, which is a good thing because it's a form of slavery, then you have soldiers who are signing up because they get money and they get free college education and stuff like that. So that's what we have now, Sargon. That's what we have now. I really don't get the issue here. When the United States was founded, it was actually founded on the idea that standing armies were bad. This very thing you just described is bad because it's how government can oppress the people. And so the whole idea of the militia was that it wasn't part of the government. The government could call it into action if there was a foreign invasion or something like that. But it wasn't the government. And if the government started getting oppressive, then the militia could be used against it. So that was the whole idea. It wasn't the government, it was the armed body of the people.
They don't operate or obey any kind of laws, and they barely even obey the person paying them. They are the worst, and that is something that cannot be done to any degree of efficiency or even any kind of good sense without a government.
See, it just seems to me that you proved that the way it can't be done with any good sense is with a government, and that the only way we can do it is with competing militaries ready to turn against each other if need be. If one military goes stomping around, trying to oppress the people, then the other militaries are there to stop them. Yeah, and again, this is what I don't get.
How can you rationalize basic philosophical concepts such as non-aggression principle as being quote-unquote too difficult for society to be educated on and abide by, yet believe that hundreds of thousands of pages of federal and state regulations, clauses, case files, and amendments are somehow easier?
Personally, I don't subscribe to the non-aggression principle.
That's kind of funny because earlier, like I pointed out, you actually did.
On preparing to do violence against me, then I am perfectly within my rights to do violence to them first.
Well, yeah, if the threat is real and imminent, and that's the case now anyway in most places of the world, so I don't really get what your objection here is.
But secondly, the average person doesn't need to know any of these things because they generally aren't affected by all of these things. Most of these things are industry specific. I have a friend who works in the pharmaceutical industry and his entire job is just regulation. He has to quality check all of this stuff, and so he has to know these regulations.
And you don't see that as an issue? I mean, I've pointed this out before. Every day, the Federal Register publishes all of the new regulations that were passed the previous day. And they average about 200 pages long, and it's really fine print, and I forget what I calculated it to be, but it's basically it would take you 12 hours a day just to read the new regulations that were passed the previous day. And you say, oh, well, yeah, but a lot of those are industry specific and they don't apply to you. Well, how do you know unless you read them? How do you know unless you actually sit down and read the regulations? It is crazy.
These regulations are there for a purpose. The average person doesn't know anything about this and they don't need to.
Except for all of the ones who all of a sudden find themselves going up against the SEC or whoever because they innocently formed a business and transacted with people in a peaceful way that no reasonable person would have a problem with, but they went against some obscure regulation somewhere. There's a book, I forget who wrote it, but it's called something like 3 Federal Felonies a Day. And that's what happens. The average American commits at least 3 federal felonies every day just by living his life, because there are so many laws and they are so complicated and even contradictory. You turn right, you violate one law. You turn left, you violate another. You go straight, you violate a third. You make a U-turn, you violate a fourth. I mean, it's crazy.
These economic migrants are not being imported. They are being allowed in. And I'm obviously against this as well, so I guess this is another failure of the term statist.
Oddly enough, I just about agreed with Sargon, and then he kind of took a left turn. Yes, there is a difference between importing goods across borders and people immigrating, people crossing borders peacefully of their own free will. And I really don't understand the statists that are in favor of free trade but for immigration restrictions. How come inanimate objects can be allowed to cross borders freely but not human beings? And so I was about to agree with him, and then he kind of did that major left turn. So next question for Sargon. Why should it be considered an act of aggression for someone to walk across an imaginary line placed on a map by politicians and bureaucrats, usually as the result of some war or another?
If it's wrong for you to do a certain thing, can you, by voting, make it right for someone else to do the exact same thing?
I think I've answered this question 3 times now, but yes, that's exactly how the social contract works.
And that's another good reason why it's invalid. If you don't have the legitimacy to do something of your own, how can you possibly defer that to someone else?
Is the method by which we determine legitimate political authority and the properties of that authority. So yes, you can.
Notice that he didn't actually defend it. He just said you can, but he didn't say why if it's immoral for you to take your gun and stop that guy from working for $7 an hour, why all of a sudden is it moral for you to vote for a government to go and do it? He doesn't ever get around to answering that.
Competitive market ingenuity of capitalism can deliver us things like iPhones, 3D printers, and private spaceships. Why should services as important as justice, roads, and defense be monopolized by the state?
Because these services are necessary for everyone in society.
If they're necessary for everyone in society, then the market will provide them. Just like the market has pretty much provided everyone with smartphones nowadays. I mean, you can go in and you can buy a prepaid smartphone for $20. That's not much of a barrier.
Simply people who can afford them.
The way the free market works is by making things more affordable for the most number of people. Again, like I just pointed out with smartphones.
I swear to God, I'm not trying to be a dick about this, but can you imagine a society where justice was predicated on wealth?
I don't think I have to, because I think we're living it, you and me both. I mean, come on, why isn't Hillary being prosecuted? How come cops can shoot people? How come cops can beat a homeless guy to death, audio and video, and still get off scot-free? Yeah, I don't have to imagine it.
The fact that you needed to distinguish between right-wing statists and other statists just, again, goes to show the failure of the term statist.
See, I don't really get this. You complain when they cast a broad net, trying to get a good answer from someone in there, and then you complain when they specify it to the particularities of one particular form of statism. I don't get it, Sargon.
I'm not in favour of drug laws in general. I don't think that drugs should be criminalised, and I don't see the point of them. They don't work. Prohibition on drugs has never worked.
Oh, but Sargon, isn't it a part of our social contract now? How does that work? Isn't that a contradiction?
It's a kind of the socialism that you love. Why do you think that that's going to work better than the private sector?
Honestly, I'm baffled that I have to answer this question.
You don't have to answer any of the questions, Sargons. They're not directed at you individually. It's just like, if that is what you believe, then why? If you don't believe it, then just skip over the question.
Private police forces, military, laws, and prisons are all very bad things, especially if all combined together.
Can you cite any evidence for that?
I mean, especially if this is predicated on wealth as well. The rich people are controlling private police forces, militaries, and writing private laws that then...
Again, that's pretty much what's happening now.
Other people have to abide by. I mean, who's going to make them abide by their own laws? We have enough problems with that as in the state itself. In the example of Hillary Clinton, making the FBI prosecute her for the things she has tangibly done wrong.
Don't look now, Sargon, but I think you're making our point.
In a system where literally everyone has to abide by the same laws, we're
Except, as you just pointed out, they don't, do they?
having a problem making everyone abide by the same laws because of certain factors and privileges that some of them have. And you think that's going to be less of a problem in a system that would specifically incentivize it?
This is the system that specifically incentivizes it. A system where there is competition would disincentivize it, because all you would be doing by doing this sort of thing is making this whole niche market ready for a competitor to spring in and do something better.
The worst case scenario is that you live near people who are not good, and the best way to incentivize anyone to do anything is to play on their own self-interest. For example, if you rob me, you will not only go to jail, but your future career prospects will also be harmed by your criminal record that an employer will see.
And in an anarchy, not only would... assuming they survive the attempt, right, to keep and bear arms, that's enough of a deterrent as it is, I would think. But, yeah, they would say, okay, you have to give him his stuff back and maybe even pay him restitution, and then you would be known from there on as a robber, and when you go to the store, sorry, we're not going to sell you food. No, because you robbed that guy. So, now what are you going to do? Now where are you going to get food from? You're going to have to go live off the land or something.
That will prevent you, in most cases, from being robbed by people who otherwise might not have a moral compunction in robbing you.
Except it's not really working out that way, is it?
So how can you look your opponents in the eye and claim that your regulations are somehow for the common man?
Well, aside from the fact that this seems like an absurdly utopian fantasy.
Why? What reason do you have to think that something like that wouldn't have taken place given the economic data? That's what the economic data really strongly suggests would happen.
Remind you, I'm not an economist. I'm going to suggest that perhaps the regulations you're referring to are not applied to the common man. They are applied to massive corporations, hugely wealthy individuals, and various industries to prevent them from being predatory.
Except the opposite is the case, Sargon. Why do you think all of those very same big corporations are lobbying for these regulations? Why do you think they lobbied for the Clean Air Act? Why do you think they lobbied for all of these? Because they know that every single regulation in existence, every single one, increases the cost of doing business in some way. And since that is the case, it is going to adversely affect small businesses and startups and other forms of smaller competition, because those very same big corporations that you're complaining about can better absorb the costs. And we see this over and over and over again. And I don't really think you have to be an economist to understand that that is inevitably going to be the case. And so you say that it doesn't affect you and me. Well, it does. Even if you and I personally are not bound to comply by the regulations, what happens every time you go to the store and buy something, and that thing costs several times what it would have if it wasn't for all of this regulation, if there wasn't the added cost of production in, and if you could have more competition and more startups and things like that? I mean, how is that not the case?
Because a person getting high isn't the same thing as a person having a gun. One thing does not have the potential to kill me, and the other thing does.
The potential to kill you. So I'm not allowed to have anything that has the potential to kill you. Okay, well, let's say not about getting high. Let's say driving a car. Or even just all sorts. I mean, I could find all sorts of things that have the potential to kill you. The potential to kill, that's an excuse that you could use to deprive someone of practically anything. I'm sure that you could even say the same thing about marijuana, because, I mean, that's the sort of thing they're trying to claim now in Colorado, which is not true, by the way, but they're saying, oh, now in Colorado there's all this crime because of legal weed, and there's all these traffic accidents because of legal weed. There isn't, but it's the same argument you're making, Sargon. It's the same argument you're making. It doesn't matter if I have the potential of killing you. It only matters if I actually make an attempt. That's the thing that matters. You cannot punish someone for what you're afraid they might do at some unspecified point in the future. There has to be a real and legitimate and imminent threat of it.
Can't do without government permission. Build a house.
Because there are cowboy builders who will build houses that are not safe and sell them to people telling them that they are.
Okay, go back to the 19th century in this country. There were basically no building codes, and you had these cowboy builders all over the place. Or even worse, all of these amateur farming families building their own houses. And amazing how many of them are still up. So, see, this is the kind of thing that happens. Government comes along and says, oh, well, wouldn't it be horrible if this sort of thing happened, even though this sort of thing hasn't happened? So let's pass this law, just this tiny one, just to make sure, just as a little stopgap measure, just to make sure we're protected. And then you add a little more and a little more and a little more, and then you get so many, and then you have generations passed until you get to people like you and me who have never lived in a world without those kind of regulations, and you kind of assume, well, of course, if you didn't have it, that's what would happen. Well, where's the evidence of it, Sargon? Where's the evidence?
Drive a car.
Because cars are very large and dangerous objects, and a certain level of proficiency driving one is required to minimize the chances of someone being run over.
Have you seen some of the things they give driving licenses to these days? You're not really making your point here.
Own a gun.
Because there are lunatics out there who will shoot people if given access to a gun.
The lunatics are going to get guns. That's something that lunatics have demonstrated over and over and over again. Gun control just means victim disarmament. That's really what it is. And, I mean, what do you expect the police to do? You know, the insane gunman comes in and points his gun at you, and then half a nanosecond later, a policeman jumps out and says, you know, drop the gun. No. When seconds count, the police are just minutes away. The best way to protect yourself, and the statistics have proven this over and over and over again, is to have the potential victims be armed as well.
And preventing their access to a gun is the only thing preventing them from shooting people.
Name one time where that's actually worked.
Go fishing.
I imagine this is something to do with sustainable levels of fish in local lakes and rivers.
Which is the tragedy of the commons, and which we have known the solution for centuries, which is property rights. Oddly enough, it's your country that gets this right, at least in some cases, because a lot of times a property owner will own the portion of the waterway going by his home, which means he has the legal right to fish in there as much as he wants. But since he owns that property, he has the incentive not to overfish, not to damage the wildlife or the ecosystem or anything like that, because then he wouldn't be able to fish anymore. And there's an organization over in your country called Fish Legal, which you might want to take a look at, which actually works on behalf of these owners to go against polluters or anyone else causing damage to these waterways. They actually sue them on their behalf in court. The property owners get 100% of the damages. Fish Legal doesn't even take a contingency or any of that. They're funded solely by donations. So check it out. That's something that works. That's something that works, and that's something that you could easily set up without government.
I have no idea, but I imagine there is actually a good reason for it.
You imagine there's a good reason for it, because your benevolent government would never do... Okay, never mind.
Hunt.
I imagine this is to prevent the extinction of animals in various locations from overhunting.
Again, we know the solution. In fact, this has actually been proven as a way of helping endangered species like elephants and rhinos, because throughout most of Africa, it's illegal to hunt them, which means you have poachers who are very skilled at evading the law. Just like you have with drug dealers or whatever. Prohibition doesn't work. But what you have are a couple of countries, I forget which ones, who say, okay, you can hunt these things if you have the permission of the property owner. And so what the property owners can do is sell you a permit, and it's something like $1 million to shoot one elephant. But it works, because now the property owners, for the same reason Apple doesn't set fire to their own factories, well, you're not going to let them overhunt all of these animals on your property, because that's future value, because you want to preserve that. And so in those countries where it is legal to hunt elephants and rhinos with permission of the private property owner, in those countries, those populations are making a comeback, whereas they're still dwindling everywhere else.
Get married.
Well, a marriage is a legal contract that creates a single economic unit, so I imagine the government probably would need to be involved with that.
The only thing the government should have to be involved in is just registering the contract and providing for the court system in case there are any contractual disputes. But if you look at all the crap you have to go through to get married now, they've kind of gone a bit beyond that, haven't they? I mean, really, why should you have to do anything other than, here's this thing, we're married, we signed it, and maybe here's the name that's officiated and a couple of witnesses, or maybe get it notarized or something, and then take it down to the Register of Deeds. Why should it be any more complicated than that? And again, you can easily imagine something like that happening in an anarchy as well, and actually happening a lot better, because then they wouldn't be able to say, oh, well, gays can't be married. Oh, well, you won't register, my contract with this person of the same sex I've just married. Okay, I'm just going to go to your competition. Who'll gladly do it.
Leave the country.
I refer you to Lauren Southern complaining about economic migrants. If you want to know who is coming into or going out of your country...
Why should you have to know that? Why is it any of your business?
Start a business.
Yes, because some businesses have harmful consequences if they are not well regulated and managed.
Name one. Go on. Give me an example.
And you cannot simply...
Yep, no examples. Yep, that's what I thought. Again, you cannot punish someone for what you're afraid they're going to do.
Rely on a person's goodwill to well regulate and manage their business.
No, but you can rely on their enlightened self-interest, and if you have a system of free market economics where people are actively punished for that because they can just go to the competition, why on earth would anyone buy a product with lead paint at any price when there are any other options available?
Fly on a commercial plane.
Allahu Akbar, my dude.
Really? You just went there? Okay. Here's something to look up for you, Sargon. Before 1968 in the United States, anyone who wanted to could bring a gun on a plane. How many hijackings were there before then? Look it up.
Big drugs.
What kind of drugs? Are we talking pharmaceuticals? Because
Why does it matter? I mean, you just said that marijuana, I believe we were talking about, shouldn't be illegal. Do you feel the same way about heroin and cocaine? Well, if anyone should be able to buy heroin and cocaine, why not hydrocodone or gabapentin or Prozac or anything else? If it's your body, why isn't it your right to put whatever you want to into it?
pharmaceutical regulations prevent thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths every...
No, they don't. They prevent only a handful of deaths, and they cause thousands more by delaying the introduction of life-saving drugs. There have been several analyses on this, and the results range all over the place because it is kind of a hard thing to count. But, and I believe this is from like the late 60s or something like that, the FDA has resulted in somewhere between 200,000 and 4 million deaths because of all of the delays caused by their regulations. Whereas it's really been just a handful. You know, you have a drug that causes deaths and they have to recall it, and you look at it and it's 5 deaths or 12 deaths or 20 deaths or something like that. Not thousands.
Work.
You don't need government permission to work.
Yeah, you actually kind of do.
You may need to pay the government money from the money you earn from your work, or you may, as an employer, need to follow...
I guess he's never heard of a work permit.
...certain rules and regulations...
Or child labor laws.
...on who you employ...
Which, by the way, are not aimed at children but teenagers.
...and how you employ them. But you...
Or minimum wage laws, which say that if you're not capable of creating a certain amount of earnings for your employer, you're effectively prohibited from having a job because there's no way he can afford to hire you. I can keep going if you want.
Actually do not need government permission to work.
Yeah, you really do.
It's actually hard to think of something that doesn't require government permission.
Pissing, wanking, shitting.
Okay, let's see. Pissing. Well, let's do pissing and shitting first. It is illegal in this country to have a toilet that uses more than 1.6 gallons per flush. Illegal. Against the law. And wanking, believe it or not, yeah, there are laws in place. I have no idea how they'd enforce them, but there are lots of localities that have in the past had laws against masturbation. And there have been places where, like, they wanted to open like a sperm bank, you know, for sperm donations, where the local government had said that you're not allowed to do that because the way you donate sperm is by masturbating. So there you go.
Talking to someone. Okay. What about all those regulations on the telephone system? What if you wanted to set up a better telephone system and government keeps getting in your way? What about like you have in Brazil, where they're going after places like WhatsApp, because if you want to talk to someone over WhatsApp, it's done encrypted in a way that the government can intrude on. And they're doing the same thing here. They're saying, oh, no, this is horrible. We need to have an encryption backdoor the government get into. So, yep, talking to someone. Having friends, having relationships.
Okay, let's see. We talked about the gay marriage thing, so there's that. There's also laws against cohabitation. Those exist in the UK, too, more so than in the US, I think.
Owning anything.
Do you live in the real world, Sargon? Or is this just such like a normal everyday thing to you that it's become blinded? You know, it's kind of like that video where the guys are passing the basketball around and you don't notice the guy in the gorilla suit. You know, I kind of think that's what it is with you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, literally almost everything you do doesn't require government permission.
It doesn't require it, but if you run afoul of absolutely anything the government says that you can do, they come after ya. Or at least they potentially could. And that really amounts to the same thing. I mean, you could, on the black market somewhere, I'm sure, get a toilet that uses more than 1.6 gallons per flush and install it. Wouldn't surprise me. I mean, no other prohibition works. Why would that? But if they catch you, and I mean, that's the same case with, you can't really get out of it that way because, okay, you could drive a car without permission too. There are unlicensed drivers out there. Yep. So, I mean, it's the same thing. It's only if they catch you. So, yeah, it's really hard to think of anything that the government doesn't have its nose in some way or another. Not even the chair I'm sitting on. The chair I'm sitting on, there are regulations for the number of wheels the chair has to have, how long the little, I guess they're called arms, whatever, when they come out from the center. I mean, there are all sorts of regulations on that. And I mean, it's hard to think of a place where they don't have to. Most of your life is an anarchy. Most of your life is just peaceful, voluntary interactions with others that the government doesn't have to intrude on. That doesn't mean they won't.
Does that mean that all the things that were done by the democratically elected constitutional republics of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and North Korea, all those things were legitimate and justified?
This would take a long time to unpack, so I will sum it up by saying you're comparing apples to oranges. The United States government is not the same or comparable to a totalitarian authoritarian state.
But the point is, and you've used this word as well, democracy, the Nazis were democratically elected. That's how they got into power. Now, the fact that they became totalitarian after they got that power just serves to illustrate our points of the dangers of a democracy, because even a democracy can't protect you from that. If they get the power and they decide to suspend all laws and do whatever they want, how can you stop them at that point? Because you gave them the power. So really, you're just evading the question there.
If you're a proud, government-loving liberal who champions personal choice, could you please explain why I can't choose to not fund the murder of innocent children abroad?
You can. You do it at the ballot box.
No. Okay. Someone else who doesn't understand what voting is and how it works. Okay, first of all, she's talking about not wanting to pay for stuff. If she doesn't pay, if she decides to withhold that portion of her taxes, then they'll come after her. You know that. You obviously know that, which is why you went straight to the ballot box. But if you vote for Hillary, you're going to get more of that. If you vote for Trump, you're going to get more of that. And really, the only options you have, the only people you could conceivably vote for who would do that are being marginalized. They had to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars getting on the ballot in enough states to win. And Gary Johnson and the Libertarian Party spending something like $10 million emptying all their coffers, just getting on the ballot in all 50 states. And even then, they're still excluded from the debate stage. They're still marginalized by the media. When the media does condescend to talk about them, it's to insult them and spew strawman arguments about them. But that's actually a little bit beside the point. The point is you have to understand what an election is. Now, let's say that grocery shopping worked the way an election does. Now, this questioner wants the option not to pay for something. Let's say that you do not like chutney. You hate chutney with a passion, and you do not want to have to spend any of your money on it. Okay, when you go to the grocery store, don't buy chutney. But what if grocery stores worked the way voting did? Okay, so you wouldn't even have that choice. You would go to the store, and there'd be this whole big basket labeled Democrats, and this other whole big basket labeled Republicans, or in your country it would be Labor and Conservative. The labels are different, but the concept is the same. So if you choose the Labor basket, then you have to buy absolutely everything in that basket. And if it has chutney in it, oh well. Or if you choose the Conservative basket, and it has chutney in it, how are you going to avoid buying chutney in a case like that? But it's even worse than that, because you have to get one basket or the other. You can't just choose not to get a basket, because that would be anarchy. That's really what we're wanting. It's like, oh, no, you have to, you're going to get this one way or another. And it's not even that. It's everyone who goes to the grocery store votes. And if 51% of them want, say, the Conservative basket, then that's the one that everyone gets and everyone has to pay for. And then at gunpoint, they will shove that Conservative basket into your arms and make you pay for it out of your wallet, and that's what you're stuck with. And so why should you have to buy the chutney? That's the question. And you think you've answered it, but you haven't.
Vote for someone who says, I'm not going to conduct drone strikes on Pakistani villages or something like that. If you have a government that does do that, you should be petitioning them along with all of your other libertarian friends.
Petitioning them. Okay, asking them nicely. Yeah, that'll work.
Every law, no matter how big or small it appears to be, is backed by violent force and, in many cases, death.
Oh my God, just the hyperbole. Come on, guys.
It's not hyperbole. It's the truth. Ask Eric Garner. Oh, wait, you can't ask him. He's dead!
Yes. If for some reason there was a situation where I would want the government to step in and use force, then they are doing that on my behalf. So I don't have to do that.
But you are, because you were having them do it. It's sort of like, the mob boss, and he doesn't do anything, but he's got his muscle back there, Guido. It's time for Guido to break your fingers because you didn't pay the loan shark. And he's like, I don't like it when Guido breaks your fingers. Why are you making that happen, huh? That's exactly what it is. Well, he's responsible because he's the one who said, okay, do this. Well, if you're okay with the government doing that, how are you not responsible?
If somehow you threatened me to the point where someone has to use force to prevent you from hurting other people, then yes, I would kill you myself.
And libertarians don't argue with that, right? To keep and bear arms. And since you have that right, then yes, you have the right to enlist someone else to do it on your behalf. But again, you're bringing up the case of a clear initiation of force, and as I asked you earlier, why are you doing that? Because that's not the part we're complaining about.
And I don't see why you'd be so fucking stupid as to commit some sort of crime that would require you to be shot or killed in the first place. Why would you do this? Why would you be so obstreperous that you're like, you know what, no, I'm just going to keep saying no, until eventually I have to be killed to preserve the safety of other people? What kind of moron would do this? Come on. What? Again, I'm trying.
Again, you're making our point for us, because if we lived in a society where everyone had the capability of defending themselves, that's exactly what would happen. But in a disarmed society, any nutcase who manages to get a hold of a gun, which is not that difficult if you're willing to break the law, as most criminals kind of are, I think you'll agree. But you're not armed. Like I said, when seconds count, the police are just minutes away. But if you can shoot back, that kind of changes the odds.
You really want the same people who run the DMV to be in charge of your health care?
No, the people running the DMV will be running the DMV.
They're not talking about the same individuals. They're talking about the same organization. Do you not get the distinction there?
If in the libertarian utopia, I have decided to open a health clinic, and I am the only health clinic in, say, 30 miles, because I live in, I don't know, the Australian outback, the American Midwest, something like that, and a black person comes in and he's been shot, who knows why, and he's like, look, I need healthcare. Luckily, I can pay. I've got loads of money. And you go, yeah, but I don't like niggers. Then he has to die because of your bigotry.
If you ever see a situation like that, let me know, because I want to open a hospital right across the street from yours. And so would about a zillion other entrepreneurs. You wouldn't be in business for long.
The police are not governed by a faith in human nature. They are governed by a very specific and rigorous set of rules that, if they violate, they are, at least hypothetically, punished for.
Yeah, again, it'd be really nice to see some examples when you can beat to death a mentally ill homeless guy for no reason whatsoever. It's captured on audio and video, and you still get away with it. Nah, you don't have a point here, Sargon. You really don't.
Status, since the war on drugs has been an absolute failure, what makes you think a war on guns would be any different?
I don't think there should be wars on anything. And I don't...
But hold on. You've been advocating gun control, so yeah, you do want a war on guns. Because that's the same thing. It's gun prohibition instead of drug prohibition. Same thing, Sargon. Same thing.
I don't agree that a war on guns would be a good idea either.
Oh, okay, so now you're against gun control, and you're for victim armament, and for everyone's right to keep and bear arms. Okay, good. I'm glad to see you changed your mind on that in the last 7 minutes.
Can you morally justify the federal government preventing a small territory from seceding from a larger country?
This is actually a very good question, and one that I don't agree can be justified, but is going to be justified by sovereign power. I'm not going to go into it now because it would take a very long time to go through, and I'd have to go through a few things that I've recently read and pull out a few important and pertinent extracts. But yeah, very good question, and no, I think that it's not really justified. I think that people should have the right to self-determination.
Okay, when you go over this, Sargon, and I really want to see the video where you do that, please remember to take it to its logical conclusion. I live in a state called North Carolina. Maybe North Carolina wants to do a Brexit from the United States. I mean, that happened before, and they sent in people with guns, but that's a whole other story. But let's say that hypothetically, we want to exit the United States and have North Carolina be its own country. Okay, North Carolina is its own country. Well, now I live in a county in North Carolina called Lincoln County, and let's say Lincoln County wants to Brexit from, or Lee-exit, or whatever they'd call it, from North Carolina, and so now Lincoln County is its own sovereign entity. And I am in a tiny little part of Lincoln County called Catawba Springs. Maybe Catawba Springs wants to, I'm just going to say what it is, secede. I don't know how that became a bad word, but we're talking about secession here. Catawba Springs wants to secede from the rest of Lincoln County and become its own sovereign entity, its own little country. Well, and in that, I live on Killian Farm Road, and let's say everyone who lives on Killian Farm Road says, okay, we want to secede from the rest of Catawba Springs. And then everyone in the 600 block, I don't live on the 600 block, I'm not giving my address away, but everyone on the 600 block of Killian Farm Road says, okay, we want to secede from the rest of it, and you see where this is going. Now, I've got my house with my own little property lines, and I want to secede from the rest and become my own sovereign entity. Why can't I do that? So remember to take it down to its logical conclusion, which is every single individual saying, I am my own sovereign entity, I am my own free person, and I should have the ability to do whatever I want as long as it doesn't initiate force against anyone else. Be sure to take it to that level.
How is me writing down I'm in charge and then getting 20 friends to sign it any different from the drafting of the Constitution?
You don't have the power to enforce it. That's the difference.
Well, what if he does? What if he and his 20 friends all have guns? Everyone else in their area doesn't, and so they're going to go around enforcing it. I mean, that's exactly the scenario you've been fear-mongering about.
There are all sorts of questions of legitimacy that would follow from all of this. But fundamentally, it boils down to the fact that you can't enforce it.
Well, apparently you can't enforce the Constitution either, because look at what the government's been doing. But that's another discussion.
Paying a toll every time you go onto or leave a certain stretch of road is probably going to cost you more than if you pay a small amount up front and be able to use every fucking road.
Except it never really works out that way, does it? Again, my home state of North Carolina. The idea is, and you can kind of see, where they're coming from with this, you have the gas tax, and then the gasoline tax goes into the highway trust fund. And so, generally, the reason why people are buying gasoline is to drive on the roads. Not always, they're filling up their lawnmowers or whatever, but that's small potatoes compared to most of the gas you buy is driving out on the roads. So, by paying a gas tax, you're paying for how much usage you get out of the roads. Okay, and then it goes into this highway trust fund. If you want to go into Raleigh and take a look at the highway trust fund, you can't miss it. Just go downtown and look for this big cookie jar that has all of these politicians dancing around it and putting their hands in it. That's what the highway trust fund is in North Carolina. And, I mean, it is just this expensive mess. Our current government, I'm no fan of Republicans, but I will give them props for at least making an attempt to make it a little better. But that's come at the expense of when new roads are put in, they're doing absolutely ridiculous things. I mean, I could show you some of the intersections they've put in and you would just be shaking your head. I mean, it is really crazy. So again, that's not how you get efficiency. Competition is how you get efficiency. And that's exactly what you don't have here.
Why is every logical explanation we provide about how something will work just pure speculation, while any doomsday scenario you pull out of your ass about anarchism is absolute truth?
You're not going to like this. You're not going to like this at all. Your logical explanations are shit. That's why.
Okay, care to say why?
I'm going to give it to you straight. The logical explanations you propose are flawed. Deeply.
Can you show the flaws?
Deeply flawed. And the things that we're pointing out are the flaws in your logic.
No, you're fear-mongering about scenarios that you have no evidence will happen and yet seem to happen all the time with states.
That's why. I know you're going to be upset. I know you're going to be upset by that. And I'm not trying to upset you.
I'm not upset. I just want actual logical response. Just instead of just fear-mongering, oh, well, this, gang of armed thugs might take over and rule over your life, so we need a gang of thugs to rule over your life to prevent it. You really don't see why we take a problem with that. Oh, and then, your private police officers might start killing people and getting away with it. Well, the government police are killing people and getting away with it. Do you not see that from our point of view, all of the things that you're fear-mongering about already happen with a state? So if nothing else, what have we got to lose?
But you guys don't seem to listen. I've had lots of conversations with libertarians, and they never seem to understand why these things won't work. Everything you say is utopian. Absurdly utopian.
It is not even remotely utopian. How many libertarians have uttered the phrase, utopia is not an option? It's statism, if anything, that's utopian, because the idea is, oh, we'll just give power and money to this group of people and give them a monopoly on violence over a geographical area. How do you fucking get more utopian than that? But what's utopian about you might have to arm yourself to protect yourself from someone doing harm? If we're utopian, why do we place such emphasis on the right to keep and bear arms? This isn't about utopia. It was never about utopia. Utopia is not an option. Again, this is not about us having an idea of some idealized form of society and then essentially forcing that on everyone else. It's about we have no idea how such a thing might come about, and so we would just like to set people free to explore their own options. That's all libertarianism is.
And would never actually pan out in reality. And there's normally a historical precedent we can point to.
Except your historical precedents always involve governments.
For example, in the perfect ANCAP society, what happens to the statists?
Whatever wants to. I have a video on this. It's in my Atheism and Libertarianism series. If you're a Marxist and you think that workers should own the means of production, then by all means, when you build your factory and you hire people, by all means, feel free to give them a share of your company. That's okay. If you're a dyed-in-the-wool communist and you want to go and legally acquire a plot of land and say, okay, everyone who agrees with me, come onto this plot of land and live like a communist, we don't recommend it or anything, but we won't lift a finger to stop you as long as you're not forcing anyone to go along with it. It's the force that how many times? What does it take to get through? It's the force we have a problem with. We don't have the first problem with anyone. We generally think that the Venus Project people are a bunch of lunatics. But if they want to get together and try it completely voluntarily, we won't lift a finger to stop them. But do statists give libertarians and anarchists that same consideration? No! Anytime we try to do something different, you send people with fucking guns after us!
If Hobbes is correct, then people are
Hobbes isn't correct.
Just naturally, in a state of nature, going to gang together and create a state because it provides them with certain benefits that not being a lone individual in the wilderness is going to provide.
Are those the only two options? A state or the lone individual in the wilderness? Because I'm not really seeing that. I'm seeing all sorts of other options. This is just very limited thinking that we see all the time from statists. And it's not even about the options I can see. It's about the options I can't. I mean, back in the year 2000, could you have conceived of an iPhone? There's something that Henry Ford probably didn't say, but it's been words put in his mouth. But it's still a good point. He says, if I had given people what they wanted, it would have been faster horses. So, that's the thing. It's not about this possibility or that possibility. It's not even about the other stuff that we can imagine. It's about all the stuff we can't imagine that entrepreneurs might be able to figure out. And you have no idea what that is.
What are you going to do with those people? I mean, how are you even going to stop them from doing it? Honestly, nothing about, especially anarcho-capitalism, but again, libertarianism as well, it's not going to pan out. It's just not. It's so idealistic that it's not going to work.
I love how it's idealistic to say, let's not use violence against people who aren't initiating force. Yeah, that's idealistic. But it's not idealistic to say, let's point guns at people who are in a voluntary arrangement where person A works for person B at $7 an hour and that's too low. Yeah, that's not idealistic at all.
I know. Angry libertarianism, my roads. I'm sorry. Sorry to say it, but it's just not going to work.
Okay, roads. Yeah. Funny how roads did work. The road that I live on was not built by any government initially. It was built by my ancestors and the other families here in the 1750s just because they needed to get from one place to another. And even early on in the century, it was the people who lived on the road who worked together to maintain it. And then I think it was in the 1920s, the government declared eminent domain. It's our road now. And then, ever since then, it's been a government road. And then they say, oh, well, you need our permission to drive on it, whereas you didn't need that before. Yeah, no. Learn how this works, Sargon. Do some research.
Highly do you think of yourself that you think it's your right to impose your views on people you've never met and tell them it's good for them?
Very. This is my life. It's the only one I have. And like I was saying about the social contract, it's not just to protect me from the government, it's to protect me from you.
And that's really what it's about, isn't it? It's really misanthropic. This hatred, or at least distrust, of your fellow human beings. But if your fellow human beings can't be trusted to always work nicely against you, how come all of a sudden they can be trusted to do that when they become part of the government?
We protect our president with guns, but our children with paper gun-free zone signs.
Well, what else are you going to protect your president with? And you also protect your children with guns.
No, we don't. And that's the problem. Because schools have to be complete gun-free zones. Teachers are not allowed to bring guns to school. Even though there was actually one case of a school shooting in Pearl, Mississippi, where this guy came in, started shooting students, and the vice principal didn't even have the gun on the school premises. He had it in his car, but he went and get it from his car, and he stopped the kid without firing a shot. The kid was not harmed. I think there was 1 or 2 deaths in the school, and I think he also had murdered his mother before he left while she slept in her bed or something like that. But I mean, he stopped that in its tracks because he was armed. And yet, oh no, that's horrible. We can't allow that. We can't have guns in schools. No, he's absolutely correct.
Congress has a 9% approval rating. Government can't even balance a budget. We are about to reach a $20 trillion debt. Social Security and Medicare and other socialist policies are unsustainable. The drug war kills more people than drugs itself. How can you say government is effective?
God, that's a damning indictment of the Latvian government, isn't it? Oh wait, you're not talking about the Latvian government, you're talking about the American government. Well, I think that might be a bit of a special case, given that most countries don't have thriving libertarian movements, and America does.
Excuse me? Excuse the fuck out of me? What did I get through saying earlier? What happens to the libertarians when they try to compete? We get marginalized, we get left out of the debates. I mean, okay, Ron Paul managed to get elected as a Republican. That's one libertarian we've had in government. And oh, no, it's the libertarians who are involved for our problems. Give me a fucking break! Give me a fucking goddamn break! I'm sick and fucking tired of this! We did nothing! We were given the opportunity to do nothing, and people like you give us shit for it? Bullshit, Sargon! Bullshit! The whole time the housing bubble was going on, we were the ones who were sounding the alarm. And you all were laughing at us. Oh, you stupid libertarians, you don't know. No, we beat the boom and bust cycle. Happy days are here again. And then what happens? Exactly what we predicted. Exactly, Sargon. Exactly. And then what happens? Did you see what those libertarians did? Bullshit, Sargon. And you want to go, oh, you're an angry libertarian? You're fucking right, I'm angry. Why shouldn't I be? If people had done the shit to you that you and other statists are doing to us, tell me you wouldn't fucking be angry.
There isn't just governments. There are many governments, and yours is one of them. And
they're all unsustainable when they do these things. Look at Venezuela. Again, look at your own NHS.
Frankly, it's never going to happen. It's the most ludicrous pipe dream I've ever heard. So again, I'm not even like anti-libertarian. Libertarians, there are so many people in this video that I genuinely like, like Josh, Lauren, T, probably others that I know, and I consider myself to be at least on good terms with, if not outright friends with. And yet, guys, it's never going to happen. It's just a pipe dream. It's never going to happen.
Do you know how many other things they've said that about? You kind of remind me of a guy named Julius Sextus Frontinus. He was in charge of the Roman aqueducts back in the 1st century, and he was considered one of the most brilliant engineers of his time. And the only reason I remember his name, probably the only reason anyone remembers his name, is from something he said, which was that everything that can be invented has been invented, and there is no hope for future advancement. How do you know what's going to happen and what isn't? What, were you hit by a divine revelation or something? I mean, there were people who were saying that at the American Revolution, that there was no way they were going to toss off the British government. This huge empire with the world's biggest army, and this ragtag group of colonists is going to throw them out. There were people in the colonies, in the American colonies, who said that, and were against independence for that reason. They weren't against independence as a concept, but they were just saying it's not going to happen, and yet it did. And yet it did.
The US government can ensure that all of the states are playing by the same rules, whereas the US government is incapable of ensuring that another state is playing by those very same rules. This is one of the things that Donald Trump is always going on about, with his trade deals with China and Mexico, and how you're getting killed in trade.
Yeah, and he's completely wrong about those.
They want to play by different rules to undercut you, or to...
And by doing that, they only hurt themselves. If you understand economics, then you know, here's what our trade policy should be. We're going to trade with other countries freely. We're not going to have any restrictions on trade. We're not going to have any protectionist tariffs. We're not going to have anything like that. Nothing like that is going to go on. It's going to be free trade. And if any other country tries to undermine that or manipulate that, we'll just let them, because they're only hurting themselves. So we'll be back here raking in the advantages.
Is an individual morally obligated to do what they believe to be wrong simply to obey the law?
Unfortunately, yes. And it's just because it's your own self-interest not to break a law, even if you find that law immoral. I know, it's terrible.
Okay, so what about someone who is in chronic pain, or someone who is suffering from cancer, or something like that, whose suffering can be eased through marijuana? If a hypothetical isn't good enough for you, I'll give you a name. Peter McWilliams. He was a best-selling author, and later in his life became a libertarian, because he ended up with AIDS and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he had to take this whole cocktail of drugs to just basically stay alive, keep his viral counts down, keep his cancer down. But the problem is, the body keeps rejecting all of this, and he kept throwing it back up. Well, marijuana is very good at preventing that, at keeping it down, and actually keeping one's appetite up, which is also good. But that wasn't good enough for the state of California, and the state of California arrested him, or it might have been the federal government, I'm not sure which, but at the time it would have been either one. Medical marijuana is legal in California now, largely due to the story I'm about to tell. They arrested him, and his mother and his brother each put their homes up as bail to get him out. And so they said, okay, well, you're out, but if we catch you taking marijuana again, we're going to take their homes. And he didn't want them to take their homes. He didn't want them to be homeless. So he refrained from using the marijuana. Now, I don't think people really get the horror of what was happening. But when you repeatedly throw up like that, do you have any idea what happens? His throat was decaying and rotting. His teeth were rotting out. It was absolutely horrible. And then one day, he took the medicine, he vomited, he choked on it, and he died. When there was no reason for that to happen. No reason at all. So, I mean, it's not like what you're saying. It's not like, oh, well, you can just not obey the law. But what about the times when obeying the law kills you? Oh, just not break the law. Okay, well, that worked out great for McWilliams, didn't it? The really heartbreaking thing about McWilliams is the fact that he never had a bad word to say about anyone. And the only thing he said about the horrible, vicious, evil, uncaring misanthropes who were doing this to them, the only thing he ever said about them was, I just want them to see me as human. I just want them to see me as a human being. That's what the state doesn't do. You're not a human being to the state. You're just an object for them to use and abuse for their own ends. And that's all you will ever be. Because any organization that has the legitimate power to initiate force will ultimately dehumanize anyone it has such power over. Every time, all the time.
Again, honestly, this all does come down to the social contract. I recommend reading Leviathan, Rousseau, and I'm about to start Locke. And there are
yeah, you might want to also throw in some Hume in that, and maybe some Thoreau, and who knows, maybe even some Murray Rothbard. I think you might find that a little bit enlightening.
It's an evil to kill someone. But if I see someone, raping, abusing, and about to murder someone else, killing that person may well be the moral thing to do.
No, it's the necessary thing to do. There's a difference. I've said this in other videos before. It is very important to keep those two ideas separate. You are not doing the moral thing. You are not doing the right thing. You are merely doing the necessary thing. And when you understand that, you see why it becomes an appropriate course of action. Because you are doing what is necessary to stop it, which means it would be immoral to go beyond that. So you limit yourself to that. But as soon as you start thinking of it as being moral or right, it's a slippery slope. And it's not that far from there to pointing guns at the guy who's hired someone to work at $7 an hour.
Either we go full authoritarian and none of you get what you want, or we go full libertarian and you can both have what you want. Which sounds more appealing to you?
Or one person can get what they want and the other person doesn't get what they want, because the thing that one person wants doesn't harm other people, but the thing the other person wants does.
And again, libertarianism is based on the non-aggression principle. So if what you want to do harms someone else, you don't get to do that. Just at least answer these questions in the spirit in which they are asked. This goes back to what I pointed out earlier. You want to run a factory the Marxist way? Go right ahead. We won't stop you.
I think we should apply this reasoning to almost every issue.
Oh, so we should apply the non-aggression principle to every issue. Okay, glad you agree and you're a libertarian again. Of course, this is like the third or fourth time you've flipped in and out of being a libertarian, so I'm not sure what kind of cognitive dissonance is going on here.
Like I said, of all the ideological groups on the internet, I find libertarians, and not just on the internet, but generally, I find them one of the least objectionable, because everything is predicated on a moral stance to be the least harmful to one's fellow man as possible. And I think that's very noble. But I also think that their suggestions are misguided, and I don't think they're ever going to pan out. And I don't think that they understand that not everyone in society is like them.
Okay, here's the issue. You don't think it's going to pan out. Fair enough. Why stop people from trying? That's all we're asking for, Sargon. Just let us make an attempt. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We'll try something else, but just let us try. Why is this so much to ask for?
And finally, libertarians, you have to stop talking about statists.
Oh, we have to stop talking about the very thing we oppose. Oh, okay, that's great.
I know, that sounds crazy, right? That sounds like way out there, but statists are not a monolith.
Well, religious people aren't a monolith either, and yet you don't seem to have any problem with atheists talking about religion in general and about the problem of believing things that are unproven and just taking things on faith and believing in the supernatural and things like that, things that they all have in common. Again, why is this any different?
Being specific when you talk about statists.
Well, when they were being specific, you complained that they were being specific, so make up your mind.
Basically, you have made statists the other. I mean, just look at the contempt that you guys have shown throughout this video.
Why should we show contempt for people who want to initiate force against peaceful people and call it good and moral and legitimate and go against the people who are saying that that's a bad thing? Why should we show contempt for them? Gee, let me think.
I was having a real hard time not being a dick in this video. I really was.
And yet you still kind of were.
And just, not mocking. Because you guys have obvious contempt for those people that you think are statists. You've otherized them completely. And you don't even know who you're talking about. You couldn't even tell me what statist... I mean, you guys had to then start delineating between types of statist.
Because sometimes we're talking about things that apply to all statists, and sometimes we're talking about things that apply to only a subset. Just like, as atheists, sometimes we're talking about things that apply to all religious people, or all people who believe in God, or whatever, and sometimes we're only talking to a subset, like Christians or Muslims or whatever. There's no difference, Sargon. You're complaining about nothing here. And it really just comes across as an excuse to dismiss everything.
Honestly, it does come back to these cult behaviors that Diekman was saying about.
It's really, really funny and ironic that he's leveling this accusation against libertarians. Could there be anyone more individualistic than libertarians? And everything that's been talked about, the connective thread running through every question and every claim and everything that all these libertarians have brought up, is an absolute dedication to the idea of individualism. And I even showed you earlier how the word statism actually means being in opposition to individualism. And yet you're trying to make it out like we're the ones who are doing the collectivizing, when what we've been doing is speaking out against collectivism. I really don't think you understand what collectivism means. It doesn't mean like talking to a group of people. If you say, oh, okay, well, Christians believe this or that. Oh, you're collectivizing them because there are Catholics and there are Protestants, and you can see how that's absurd. Take your response and reframe it in the form of an argument against atheism. Oh, well, in one case, you're collectivizing all religious people by saying, they believe in God or believe in the supernatural or whatever it is. And then in other times you talk specifically to Catholics. Well, yeah, because that's the way it works. It's no different, Sargon.
As soon as you start thinking of yourself as morally superior, then you start thinking of other people necessarily as inferior.
No, not if you're an individualist. Don't project your collectivist thinking onto us. We don't think of anyone as inferior. We think of ideas as inferior. And your ideas absolutely are inferior, Sargon. Except for those cases where you've agreed with us. All the times you've disagreed, it's just been the same old, same old. That's why this video was made. We keep trying to further the conversation, and statists just keep coming back with the same old, same old. And yes, that's true of statists across the board. Progressives, conservatives, Labor Party people. Whatever form of statism it is, that's what keeps happening. I mean, I have a whole series that is basically begging you to come up with good arguments for statism. How to argue for statism. Bunch of them. Right? If you want to take just a look at one, look at how to argue for universal health care. Because you've come out in favor of the NHS in the past, why not take a look at that and respond to it? I mean, we are basically begging you to come up with good and rational defenses of the state. And I mean, you don't have to do it of every state, and you don't have to do it of everything that a particular state does, but whatever brand or flavor of statism that you conform to, even if it's your own unique thing, just come up with a defense for it. That's what we've been begging you to do all along.
You start becoming a cult. You start finding yourself locked into these cult patterns of behavior, especially...
Except we're not the ones doing that. I have another video on this called What is the Cult of the Omnipotent State? Goes over, one by one, all the aspects of a cult that conform to the state. None of them conform to libertarianism.
If you can place all of the blame on someone else, and you can, it's the government and the damn statists.
Well, because we have evidence for this. We have evidence all over the place. We are burying people under mountains of evidence, and you keep ignoring it.
Because I had this hangout with that guy T, and I saw him doing it. I saw him getting emotional.
Oh, we're getting emotional. Oh, well, you see, you're not allowed to do that.
this is not the right way to do it. And like I said, I'm not trying
One of the parts of how to argue for statism is why we're rude to you. And I think you would do really well to watch that video and consider it.
You're going to find yourself locked into your sort of small ideological community like the SJWs.
We don't have a small ideological community. Take a look at libertarians, or just go to any libertarian meeting. Tell me there's anything monolithic about it. The phrase herding cats doesn't even begin to cover it. We're all sorts of people who come from all sorts of... There could not possibly be a bigger tent. The only thing that is required for you to be a libertarian is what you keep acknowledging over and over and over again. As long as you're not committing acts of aggression against anyone, you should be left alone. Well, except for taxation and healthcare and all the other stuff you've come up with. But really, that's the only thing. That's the only thing that's required to be in the Libertarian Club. So, why isn't it you that are the cultists? Why, because you have superior numbers? Isn't that an argumentum ad populum?
With misogynists and Black Lives Matter with racists and all this sort of stuff. You're statists are them.
Except, in our case, we can actually support it. You said it yourself, Hillary's not going to be prosecuted. I've said this many times. There is a privileged class in this country. The conflict between the privileged class and the oppressed class isn't white versus black. It isn't men versus women or anti-feminists versus feminists or anything like that. It is the political class versus everyone else. They can do what they want and get away with it. They do it in your country. They do it in mine. They do it basically everywhere. And it really seems like no matter how much you try and put in the way of this, no matter how many checks and balances you have in there, it always converges towards this. So, given that, how are we in any way irrational about doing this, about saying that that shouldn't be allowed to happen? It's not the abuse of power, it's the power to abuse.
When they think of the white supremacy, you're thinking of government. When they're thinking of misogynists, you're thinking of statists.
Yeah, because we've seen them actually get away with it. And, I mean, if you look at Black Lives Matter, where they talk about, cops killing black people, well, cops kill white people too, and black cops kill black people, and white cops kill white people, and white cops kill black people, and black cops kill white people. So we don't really see a division of race there, but we do see this division of power between the ruling classes, the political classes, and everyone else.
That's exactly the same thing.
Except we have evidence.
Like, there is no such thing as, like, a self-identified misogynist. There is no group of misogynists,
And yet there are, in fact, misogynists.
You've got to stop using the term statist.
Even though there are, in fact, statists.
Government as a scapegoat for everything you think is wrong in society.
We don't do that. We look at the evidence and we show how government is the problem.
I honestly mean this. I'm doing this generally to try and help them understand why there aren't more libertarians. Because, like I said, I don't think their principles are bad. I just think they're unpragmatic.
Oh, unpragmatic. I heard a great word. What was it? Pragmatism? Something like that. It was just beautiful. A pragmatism, obviously a portmanteau of pragmatism and orgasm. It's where you have this beautiful, pragmatic argument for something that allows you to completely go against any and all moral principles. So, there's a room for pragmatism, but I think we have that too. I have that whole series of analyses where I plot the regression trends against the more economically free states and the less economically free states for all sorts of things, including things like, gender income inequality, overall income inequality, wealth inequality, things like that. And just over and over and over again, we see that, on the whole, it's the freer states that do better with those things. So, yeah, I think we win the pragmatic side too. Except that when you have that pragmatism, you just kind of lose sight of all that, and it really becomes more of a way of rationalizing what you think you already know or what you wish to believe, as opposed to the way things really are. Until next time, stay strong and be free.